Hello everyone, it's Chris here. Welcome to the show. I'm glad to have you here. Spread the word, join the channel if you want to. The usual things which people normally ask you to do. Frankly, I don't care. Um, I don't care. But I do care about the books actually because there's messages in the books which are, I think, relevant, it's current, and it's also important for you to know it. And that's the reason why, of course, I wrote it. I mean, a book always have a message in it. If you don't have a message in a book, then it's supposed to be art, isn't it? People say that art can only be something which has no functional use, which is why if people come out, you find these strange journalists, most of them educated at Oxford and, these fancy Ivy League US universities. I know Oxford is in the UK. And they would look at a car and they would describe it as a piece of art. Technically that is not possible according to the artist, because a car has a function end of the day. It's just a damn car, man. There's an engine and there's four wheels and there's a gearbox and there's a steering wheel, and that's basically that's a car. I'm very cynical about such things. So I don't consider myself to be an author or an artist or anything like that. But I do think that a book should have a message. Otherwise, what's the use of writing it? It's just, for me, it's the way it is. But it doesn't matter what I think. It's what you think as the reader and, I suppose, the listener, because the books are all in audio, which I'm really grateful for. It's, of course, doesn't sound like me at all because it's artificial intelligence. I cannot afford, to be honest, to get a genuine actor somewhere to read the book in a nice South African accent. So it's being read in an American accent. Still, if you know me and you know the books, you will find me inside the books. But that's the way it is. That's how you can know that who wrote the book. When that author of Harry Potter, now Harry Potter is totally satanic. If you have Harry Potter books in your house, just get rid of them. If your grandchildren have them, get rid of them. It's totally, totally demonic. I mean, even the characters he used are based upon actual satanic deities. Nevertheless, I understand it's really good books in the sense that millions and millions, well, it's the most popular book after the series after the Bible. I mean, the Bible is the most popular book in the world. And then there's the Harry Potter series. But the point is, you cannot really write those things unless you know something about the subject. So you have to wonder about this female who wrote it, and we give her all credence. But then afterwards, she started another series with some detective type of thing. Now I don't read detective stories at all. I was in the police. I find detectives boring people, to be honest. Very brave men and women, actually. As I say in my books, the Mean Street series, you would find him go out alone and just arrest a murderer and come back with him. And in the old days, I had an uncle in the police. We were not really family, but we had the same name. Many of you who's from Kumga or from King Williamstown or that part of South Africa will remember Warrant Officer Dennis Kotze. Now, Dennis was a great friend of my father. They knew each other very well because both were pigeon farmers. And Dennis joined the police in 1956, and he actually had matric. So he should have become an officer very quickly, but he didn't. He never did, which is a bit weird. But he was a damn strong man. He was one of those guys, if you shake his hand, man, he would press your hand until you're red in the face. Strong man, like a farmer type. And a great man. I really respected him, Dennis. And he used to tell me that he would go out and do investigations for a week or two, and he would have like a Harley Davidson with a sidecar and a Bantu constable. That's what they called the black constables in those days, armed with a kiri, which is like a stick which you can hit people with. handcuffs. The black policemen in those days had no shoes and they had no firearms and they definitely had no, not the same social status as a white constable. Those things changed, by the way. When I enlisted in 1985, everything was the same. The salary, the weapons, the training, everything was the same. Of course, they were actually better off than us because we got a grant from the state, I think up to 53,000 rands, which is, man, I don't know, $3,000 or $4,000, probably less. To let's say $3,000, and we could buy something with it, like a property. The problem is in the white areas, you couldn't buy anything with that money. It was just not possible. It was just a joke. Not even a flat in the worst areas of the city, you just couldn't. While in the townships, our black comrades could really, they could buy something with that kind of money, so they were better off than us in that sense. But anyway, whatever. And Dennis would always tell me that he would take over his Harley Davidson and his black constable, and they would go and do some investigation work, and they would arrest 4 or 5 people. During that time, they would live on whatever they can find in the veld or wherever they could sleep. And they would be totally alone. I mean, he would have his sidearm with him and perhaps a 303 rifle, probably to hunt. And then after about 4 or 5 days, they would come back with 2 of the suspects sitting in front of a sidecar with a black constable behind him and one of the suspects behind Dennis, and 2 or 3 behind running after the motorbike. And they would bring them in, and that was the kind of respect which was there for the police at that stage. And then later, when Dennis became involved with the POCO insurrection, now, if you don't know what that is, you'll have to read those books. In the POCO insurrections, he actually arrested quite a few of them were murdered policemen, and the way they identified him is that the black policemen who got murdered took their handcuffs and they made it like something to punch with, like a knuckle duster, I think you call it, something like that. And so they could see the marks on their faces as the black policemen were fighting back before they were brutally slain. And I think 6 of them actually got the death sentence, and they were all executed on the same day at the same time. Some kind of a record or something. Anyway, that is where knowledge comes in, and I think it's important when you write about anything in life that you do have knowledge about what you write. So the book I want to talk about is one which was written actually under my own name, which is Mean Streets 2, Life in the Apartheid Police. Now, as I said in Mean Streets 1, when I spoke about it, there was a lot of people who was quite upset about me calling the old South African police force. There's a reason why I say force and not service. Service stands for SLAG. So I was never in the service, thank God. But the force was something else. The force was a very highly disciplined, trained police force, and they would enforce the laws of the land. If you don't quite understand what I'm getting at, please have a look at the first video where I explain the legal system to you, the Westminster system and Parliament, how it worked in the old days, and why the police then became an instrument of terror, as our enemies called us, and they might have been correct. But people were very angry when I used the word life in an apartheid police. It was simply so that people know what I'm talking about, because it might be of interest to us, our own history, and it should be. And I think it's the right thing if you know your country's history, but sadly in the rest of the world, people just don't give a shit. They don't even know their own history. I got no clue. I mean, I'm making this video many months before you actually watch it. But I'll remind you that just yesterday, Tucker Carlson had an interview with Senator Ted Cruz or something. Not sure from which place. And we're standing now where the US wants to assist Israel with begging for help to attack Iran, which is something which, of course, the Yukons have been masturbating about for a long, long time. Also part of a list of Wesley Clark, General Wesley Clark, who said they're going to do it. And he mentioned the names of the countries they want to overthrow. And only Iran is left. Now, I don't know what is going to happen further. My idea is, yes, I think the Americans will be stupid enough to attack Iran. And I believe they're going to find out Iran is not going to surrender. And they're going to strike back. That's my feeling. Well, hope I'm wrong, guys. I really hope I'm wrong, and time will tell. And by the time you listen, yeah, this is a long time ago. But this Senator Tex Crooks, or whatever his name is, Tucker Carlson actually asked him a few questions about Iran. He asked him, tell me, how big is the population in Iran? No idea. No, doesn't know. And then he got very upset and angry when Tucker actually started laughing at him, because you would think, man, before you go and attack somebody, perhaps you should go and flip and do some intelligence on it, you know. I mean, are you going to walk up to a guy and just punch him and not knowing it's actually some kind of a boxing champion you just punched, or somebody who can really punch you back? Will you go and do that? Are you that stupid? Yeah, if you're American, you're that stupid. You don't know your own history. It's amazing. I've already said to you, they don't have the capacity of reading more than standard 6 children. I'll put a slide in here for those who don't believe me, which means that's their level of thinking. That is why there's a bunch of dumbasses, really. They are clever people. They're very clever. My late wife was very clever. Melissa, he was quite clever. And of course, Rebecca is clever. There's no doubt about it. People often underrate her, which is what she wants. It makes her clever. But anyway, if you don't know your history, you're bound to repeat it, and that's one of the other reasons why I wrote Mean Streets, is because I wanted, in the first place, our story to come out in the SAP, because we were not the favorite of the government. After 1980, I would say, when P.W. Botha became president, or whatever, he became first prime minister, I suppose, and then president, he had to think for the army. So much of the money actually went to the army. The police were always on the back in terms of equipment. Basically, the only thing we had which the army wanted was our Casper vehicles, and of course they had the funding, and they got them. Simple as that. But the police were really underfunded and very, very badly paid. I remember, as a sergeant in the police, I was actually paid less money than a sweeper. That's a guy with a broomstick, cleaning the beer breweries in South Africa. And then such things, after a while, gets to you. I mean, the first few years in the police is just, man, it's magic. It's like when you join the world in the shadows in a great game. It is just magic, man. You're suddenly in this almost a movie type of world, and you can't believe you're so lucky to be there. And of course, you have stars in your eyes, when you leave a police college, which is what the first book is about. Lots of other things as well, but basically the basic training there at the police college in Pretoria. When you leave there, you are like really wanting to go and hunt the criminals and terrorists and protect the weak and the innocent. And that's basically why a policeman actually exists, That is, I think looking back for me, as I explained to you, I always actually wanted to be a policeman. A lot of people, when I joined the police, were shocked because they thought I was too bright, I was too smart. I was definitely university material. Guys, I'm not putting smoke up my ass, really not. I did afterwards go and got advanced degrees. And at school, I was academically quite strong. And as I say to you, I would have loved to join the army, but they told me I needed maths to go to the military academy, and so I thought, no, I don't have maths, because I dropped maths to take woodworking, which I love doing, and I'm working here at a guest house in Thailand. I'm actually sanding down the tables, and I'm redoing the chairs, and I'm having so much fun with those skills, which I haven't used in 40 years. But I also, as you know, I grew up in I grew up in the Caprivi as well as Namibia, so we were very close to the border war going on in that side. And so I saw the policemen around with their camo uniforms, and it impressed the hell out of me. I also saw, once I saw the railway police in their camo uniforms, and again, these guys to me look just, man, they look better to me than the national servicemen, and don't shoot me, please. I just, the other day I was looking at, we're making an entire video series on the parachute selection course and jump course in 1986, which was 86 was one when I was in the college. And I look at these lads, and they're tough, you can see they were tough guys, but they look so young, they look almost like innocent. And then, of course, in the police, once you graduate from the college, you're allowed to have a standard police issued mustache. Yeah, man, I had one too. I looked like a total idiot, but that didn't matter. I had to grow it in a certain way because I'm like a man now, I'm not a student constable anymore. Yeah, I'm not a puke, man. I'm not a recruit, and I'm not a recruit, and I'm not, all those names. Yeah. Listen to the first book. Of course, you couldn't have a beard unless you could produce a doctor's certificate that you had some kind of a skin problem and therefore you needed a beard. I'm having a beard these days because I'm just too lazy to shave, to be honest. I don't think I look better or worse. Don't think I can look better, actually. I wasn't blessed with good looks or anything like that. But that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. God gave me other talents. And anyway, so I joined the police because I like the camo uniform and I like the idea of protecting the weak. And even from school, I would always take the side of oppressed, which I mean, there were a lot of poor kids in our classes. Some were in the orphanage, from the orphanage, broken homes. I was damn lucky. I came from a solid middle class uh, home. I never lacked anything. My parents were happily married. They were never drunkenness, abuse, anything like that, ever. Fantastic parents. That's why I called. Actually, the story I wanted to speak about today, but I got sidetracked, which is codename GSSP 40, which is the book which I actually wrote, the 40th book in that series, which I called after my mom, who I really admired when she was still alive. I still do, actually. And I called the book GSSP 40 because that was her names, her initial, Gertruida, Susara, Stefanetta, Paulina. The old days all those people had very long names. Funny thing about my name is it's not actually Chris, it's Jacobus with a C, Jacobus. And actually, my ex-brother, I'm the youngest of 4 children, also had that name, Tienus Jacobus. I think at some stage he wanted to remove a Jacobus from his name. He might have, I don't know. I haven't spoken in many years. I have no intention of ever speaking to my former family again, which is a sad, sad thing, but it's better for all of us. People say you cannot choose your family, man, you're wrong. Of course you can choose your family. If there's just nothing to say to each other, then there's nothing to say. And I'm a black sheep. I'm a black sheep, man. I joined the police and I became an attorney. Then I went into the shadows. And then I started doing all sorts of other things as well. And you know what, as Rebecca always say, by the time that you're 50 years old, you do have a story to tell. But anyway, so I got my father's name. They did not expect me, to be honest. I was told that too. I was sort of a fluke. Came there without real intention. But I'm grateful they didn't terminate me. I'm grateful they gave me a chance to live, at least. I praise the Lord. The police is a very hard place to work at, even though it was funny. And if you read the books, you will have a lot of funny incidents there. I'll speak about a few of them just now. But it's also a place where you meet all the scum of the earth. Yeah, they sort of don't tell you that when you leave a college that you're going to, you're now thrown into the world of crime. And you're thrown in those days in the world of terrorism. And you're also thrown in the world of civil unrest. I always laugh when I see all these headlines news that, there's a riot going on in Los Angeles. Oh, there's a riot in the UK, probably London. Oh, there's a riot. Please, you don't know what a riot looks like. Just go up. You have no flipping clue what's a riot unless you've been in South Africa in the 80s as well as the 90s. You have no idea. You don't know what a riot is. You're standing there with your little horse and you just storming into people and you wish you would be dead. If you tried that in South Africa, you'd be dead. Really, you don't know anything about riots, which is why I was so annoyed when after 1990, 91, after Mr. Mandela was released, you suddenly, of course, had all these arse creepers from the police, the top management. Most of them actually went on pension, but a lot of them, and middle-ranking officers, and lower even, were starting with their arse licking like you cannot believe. And they got rewarded for that, and you know what, I don't blame them. I had the opportunity to leave and go and study law. Was tough. I had suddenly no income. I had to move back into my parents' house, which was a good thing because my dad was dying of cancer then. And so I did whatever I could. I never failed the subject, I can tell you that. I completed the degrees in the record time. And then I had to move out in the real world of attorneys, and then by that time affirmative action was there. The revenge of the dark people. And so, you would apply for a position as an attorney at, the Afrikaans firms, Poch and Poel ingesloten or whatever, and they would just tell you, yeah, go. Why? Because they also were playing the money game. They were playing games with the banks, and they can't get any instructions from a bank, and that's your bread and butter. They can't get it unless they are what? What do I hear? Affirmative action. Yes. Yes. So they became affirmative action. Then, of course, the universities changed as well. They suddenly started specializing their degrees. The LLB degree was always a postgraduate degree, which it damn well should be. That suddenly became a first degree. It was just a copy of the old BProc. You could see it. You could see in the practice. You could immediately see we went through the old system and we went through the new system. You can just see it. And in later years, they came to their senses and they made it a postgraduate degree again. But anyway, whatever. Point I'm making is that a lot of changes took place. And for us who was in the police, we were very patriotic. Really, we bled for our country. We saluted our flags. We looked up to our officers and we looked up to our leadership. And we definitely listened to our patres and chaplains. We really thought that we were on the right side of history. We were totally indoctrinated. And I also have to say to you, at ground level, when a man takes up an AK-47 and he comes back into the country to commit, according to the laws of the country, murder and sedition and treason and planting bombs and abusing the locals and torturing. Yeah, they did all these things. Yeah. Don't deny. You know it's true. You know it's true. Must I mention the word quattro cant to you? Huh? Yeah. I write about those in my books too. Yeah. TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Yeah, I read all the reports. Yeah. Police did a lot of things wrong, and but it wasn't common. Most of the guys, 99.9%, would never have done what happened at Vlakplaas and those places. And I was recruited to Vlakplaas, by the way. Perhaps I'll tell you a story. I don't know. I'm just speaking now. And I'm speaking out of my heart, guys. I have no papers with me. I wasn't going to speak about this book. I wanted to speak about GSSP 40. And then I started talking about Dennis, and I thought, well, it's a subject that I do know well, and I can just as well talk about it. Extemporare, temporare, as we say in law. When you study law, you can be so clever. Funny things, these attorneys, They talk their own language, but so does the police, and so do you. Wherever you work, you guys have a way of talking which is a bit of a closed club, isn't it? So there's certain words which is linked to the police and no one else, like a paddock, which is I don't know, a cloth which you drive anything with, I suppose, for dishes. Cloth like that. I actually have one here, like something like this, be a paddock. Now, that's what we call the typist who was sitting there typing all the reports in the police. In many ways, the police were not efficient. You get this highly trained constable, and I say highly trained in parentheses because it's not that highly trained, to be honest. There's a lot of things lacking in the police training in the college. But I did discuss them in the first video. And one of the first things which bothered us was our lack of civil training, civil law. Yeah, we basically received no training in civil law. But your problem is when you arrive at a place and now the woman is mooring with Tani. It's a husband and wife type of setup, where the husband is beating and pummeling his wife. It happens so often. It happens virtually everywhere. You would say to me it is only in the poor areas. Well, yeah, it happens a lot there, but the difference is that Tani they would move back. There's no doubt that those women would swing. And sometimes, they're very big women, and the husband's quite a tiny, skinny guy. It's a bit of an odd couple, to be honest. Yeah, I always feel sorry if I see a tall woman walking with a short man, It reminds me of the presidents of France, They all, I don't know. I don't know. That doesn't work for me. I feel the man should be taller than the woman. But that's nonsense too, Love is love and love is blind, man. But for me, it's funny. But sometimes, yeah, sometimes this guy would try his luck and this Tony would just clap his snort out of him. But most of the times, actually, when you get to an abused woman or child, guys, it's hard. It's really hard. You really get you get hard. You get tough. After a few years in the police, you do actually change. You become as hard as nails. You can stand there and see people being caned by the police, flogged, and it's really a terrible thing to witness. You hear those strokes. You can hear them 100 yards away. There's blood. It's dreadful. It's dreadful. There's no doubt about it. I'm totally against that type of thing anyway. Let's not say that to you. So, but you can stand there without any expression. It doesn't bother you. Not at that stage. It's years later when it starts, suddenly things starts happening to you. And then, of course, you also have losses. You have your own people. I always say to a former policeman, and there's a lot of you listening to me now, there was a story where the college will make a man out of you. No, that's bullshit. No, that's not true. The college will teach you about the law. It will teach you about drilling, shooting, bit of medical stuff, how to treat somebody very, very, very perfunctionary, things like that. You will learn a lot about the police rank structure, things like that. I mean, after all, you're there for 6 months. But the fact is, guys, you grow up when you see your own dead. Because up to then, you can't actually believe, because you're 18, 17, 18 years old, you cannot really believe that you, the good guys, can actually die. And then one day you're going to wake up and you see a dead policeman in uniform, or a dead detective, or you see black members. I mean, many black members were murdered in the townships. It was just a horrible, horrible time. And that's where you grow up, and then there's a lack of utter trust. After that, I mean, then you really don't trust any horseman, it's a civilian. You don't trust them at all. And you definitely don't trust a journalist, and you definitely don't trust an attorney or an advocate. They're all pieces of shite. All of it. All of it. And the last thing in the world you need is a padre or a chaplain to come and waste your time with nonsense. Of course, these days it's different. And even in my time, in the last year or so, I suddenly woke up to the fact that we're being exposed to so much violence that it had to have an effect on us. And so they would have debriefings. So basically all that was, okay, you were in a shooting incident. tell me about it, what happened, blah, blah, blah. I don't know if that works, to be honest with you. For me, I suppose I'm old school, guys, and for me it was, man, just get a bottle of brandy and have a few dopper and speak to your mates and have a cry if you want to, or whatever you want, but get over it and get going. What's that story? Tough cowboys don't cry, or what was it? Yeah, that Naasbota. Yeah, Naasbota. What can I say, Naasbota? He was in the police, of course, he did enlist in the police for a while, probably, I don't know why. I don't even know exactly where he was ever posted. I think he went to murder and robbery, but I don't think he was ever a detective. I don't know. I would like Naasbota to actually come and speak to us on the Legacy show where we speak to veterans, but I don't see the man of that status ever doing that. Why should he? But he was a fantastic rugby player, but I understand in his time in the police, or that's a story, I don't know if it's true, but they do say that he actually went on the counterinsurgency training course, and the instructors, of course, were not, repeat, not Northern Transvaal rugby supporters. They were more like WPF guys, or Western Province. And so they gone him. They went for him. I don't think he completed the course, but I don't know, guys. I'm just mentioning what was said there. But anyway, let's start with a story. I've been speaking a long time in general about the police, and I can speak for many hours because, once again, I was there. I was there, man. I know what I'm talking about. So I was posted out of a police college. I went to a place called King Williamstown, which is in the Eastern Cape. It's close to East London. That's where Steve Biko got himself killed. That very, very town. I stood at Steve Biko's grave many, many times. Wow, in those days it was just so unkept. It was just a horrible little stone there. I understand today it's like a total monument or something which they built there. It's whatever. But you would understand that if you're in a place like King Williamstown where the Xhosa people are, you're going to be exposed to a lot of nonsense. And there's also, of course, this guy is right next to it, with a headquarters called Bishu, right next to King Williamstown. Now, funny enough, our chaplain, Colonel Andre Willifeer, the former commander of the Railway Police Special Task Force and bomb disposal officer, he was also there. He was, I think, seconded to the Ciskei Police, training their special forces and doing a lot of other things in the shadows, which we don't speak about. I never saw him there, and even if I'd seen him, he would have been an officer. And I was a young constable, and there's no way I would mix with an officer. They are to be avoided, and they like to pest themselves. But it is at King Williamstown where I think I became a policeman, because within 2 or 3 weeks, a new commander arrived. Yes, Lieutenant Potgieter, who later retired as a Lieutenant Colonel Gerard Potgieter, known as Potty. Rebecca calls him Popeye because he has only one eye. But in those days, he had 2 eyes. And I say in the book that he was old for his rank. And he stood there. I will never forget this. He's the best policeman I've ever seen in my life. And I've seen many. And I remember him standing there. He was a short man, shorter than me. He was 6'2", and 6'1". Depends on whether I'm wearing shoes or not. And he was shorter than me, but exceptionally broad shoulders, and totally in shape, which was another strange thing. And he just became an officer. So he was an old warrant officer before he became an officer, which is why I say in the book that he was old for his rank. And then, of course, years later, he actually read me in streets. And he wrote to me, and he said to me, Chris, I was 27. But when you're 18 years old, a man of 27 is 1 foot in the grave, man. And he was there with his wife, and the 2 kiddies was now grown people with their own children. Whenever we in South Africa, we stop at Potty and his wife, Marwa. They were probably with SV4, the first ones onto Legacy. So they started the process. And what a gentleman, you would always find Potty opening the door for his wife. He would always be considerate. He was always calm, never got angry, always knew what to do. But he also was very willing to swing. In other words, if a guy would try his luck with him, he would just, you know, arrest him and get done. And he could drive a car. Man, this guy could drive a car quicker than I've ever seen in my life. And yeah, I'm not into motorsport at all, but this guy won every single damn prize which there is to win in motorsport. He was just exceptionally quick. And then I found out he came from flying squad in Pretoria, and I started wondering because while I was at the college, I actually attended the Pretoria show, and I saw the flying squad standing there with their Datsun Laurels and Skyline 2.8 six-cylinder cars, and I looked at that, and they looked to me like real policemen, tough guys, and of course they would respond to the first. They were first on the scene if there's serious crime going on, like a terrorist incident, a bomb explosion, or a murder taking place, or a rape taking place, or a nice pawn shop somewhere. The flying squad would arrive there first. You were first on the scene. You had 4 minutes to get there. And so I knew I would want to go to a flying squad. And about a year later, I was transferred to a flying squad. And as I always say to you, when I walked into the door, we were flying squad in Pretoria and it was brand new at that stage. We were rebuilding the building and it was basically new. And top of the line, state of the art equipment. Man, I was 20 years old and I saw a computer for the first time in my life. And when I say saw a computer, I mean I saw it. I wasn't allowed to actually touch it, but I could look at it. And they had these weirdo nerds, the very rich people today, sitting there. They were all deploying the army, I'm sure, but they were there working on the computers. And later on, of course, we could also do a few things on it, but it was fantastic. Just amazing. It was amazing. And when I walked into the flying squad, I saw this Ford Sierra windscreen right there, it was mounted like a skildery, like a portrait against a wall, and 3 bullet holes through it. And I looked at that and I thought, yeah, man, I came out. This is where I wanted to be. But before that, at the station level, you do learn about policing. And the flying squad is not for everyone. You really need a very specific type of personality to be there. Otherwise, you won't make it. And quite a few people tried and they just couldn't do it the work. They just couldn't get themselves to risk their lives at that high speed for someone else. I think they just didn't want to do it. Or a few of them, once they get married, they left. They went to another unit. Because you were really first on the scene, hostages, whatever, chases, cars, bank robberies. So your chances of in a flying squad to get in a shootout is damn good, really good. It's excellent. So you need a bit of adventure to go there. It's not that you go through a selection process, but you are weeded out. If you don't belong there, you won't get there. Simple as that. I mean, it's a specialist unit, and I'm proud of my service in the flying squad. But anyway, go back to the station level, we had a great fun there at the station. You do the normal police work. I was first assigned to the charge office, but then they realized my handwriting is so bad that there's no way in the world that I can be allowed to write in official police documents. So they told me to take a hike and walk beat. In one stage, we had bicycles. Why? Because, in a small town like that, you can actually hear, in the middle of the night, you can hear dogs barking somewhere, or you can actually hear glass breaking, or you get reports in, and then you can get there quite silently, quite quickly. And so we were quite effective by doing that. Also, um, I just want to say I don't write properly because I never learned how to write at school, meaning where you write continuously and not just spelling the letters out, because we moved so many times. Many times we moved schools. I was in about 10 schools in my life. So you get from different provinces and they have a different curriculum. So what would happen is I think I went to Namibia or someplace out west, and they were already, by that time, I standard one, already writing continuously. And I didn't tell the teachers I couldn't do it, so I just linked the letters, and so I always got an F for handwriting, but the rest I was fairly good. But I can't write properly. I mean, it's also a sign of intelligence, I'm told. Yeah, not really. Not really, of course not. But I I enjoyed my time there because they then put me on a van where I became quite famous for driving quite quickly with this van very recklessly, actually. But to be honest, we had great fun there. We really had fun doing the police work there because you were exposed to everything from shooting incidents to drunk on the street to being ugly on the street. That there is a crime like that as well. No, not really, but it can be. I once saw a guy walking in Pretoria. I'm sure he was gay or something. Walking there with his tight little shorts, and he's wearing the neon green socks with fellies and a red shirt with his white trunks. And I said to him, man, can I take you somewhere? Because if you keep walking down the street past the student hostels, they're gonna murder you. So he gratefully got into the car. I never saw him again. We just dropped him off in Hatfield or someplace. Which, yeah, anyway. I have to tell you the story about the guys very close to the US Embassy if I get to it. But anyway, in King Williamstown, the one thing which happened is that the Transkei Special Forces then decided they're going to attack their cousins at Bishu. They're going to raid Bishu and kill Lennox Sebe. Now, Charles Sebe was a police sergeant. That's a brother of the president now. Now, he was actually a police sergeant at King Williamstown in the security branch. There's a big security branch in that place. And then after the Ciskei became independent, he suddenly became a major general or something. It's amazing the promotion which went on. Saw him quite often. But anyway, this Lennox then was the president, and I don't know what happened between the two Xhosa nations, but they attacked each other. And so the Rhodesians arrived to train the Special Forces of Transkei. I think Ron Reed Daly, the Seleucid Scout commander, the ex-AS member, he was definitely very involved. So one night they decided they're going to attack Bishu. Now, Bishu, you have to understand, is 2-3 kilometers outside King Williamstown. So I wasn't on duty that night. A mate of mine was. And he said they heard the gunfire, they heard all hell breaking loose. And so they drove out to go and see what's going on. And the next moment, the tracers were just running right across. He says it was going in front of the windscreen. It was going behind him. He could see them in the rear view mirror. He could see the tracers, and then they realized, wow, something else. And they made a quick turnaround, and they came back. And then, of course, all hell broke loose. All hell broke loose. Because the next morning, we were now follow-up operations. We were the dark unit and ourselves. And we now chasing the Special Forces guys down, because when they started running after their failed attack, they were dropping hand grenades and weapons and things as they were running or retreating. And it wasn't a run like in cowardly run. No, not at all. It was, let's say, a retreat. So they moved out, but they moved through South African territory. So we started chasing them. Of course, you do feel a bit conspicuous when you know you're up against Special Forces and they are wearing camo and have R5s, which immediately struck me as there's something dreadfully wrong here, because terrorists are not supposed to have R5s. They're supposed to have AK-47s. So at that stage, of course, we didn't know it, the Transkei Special Forces. We just knew there was a terrorist attack on the president of the Ciskei, and these guys are now on the loose in South Africa, and we need to find them. And when you're doing that follow-up with your blue uniform, yeah, you do realize this is stupid. You should be wearing camo. You should have your own assault rifles, things like that. But you know what? Again, we did what we could. And then I was sent with a report to headquarters in East London, and this is actually in the book. So I took the road. It's a double highway all the way to East London, Great Highway. So I took the road and I just went there just before, just after Bright Park, which is, I think, the Collett area. Somebody shot my hat off my head there one night. That's another story. And the next moment, I was actually stopped. There were like these very sinister um, soldiers, special forces. I recognized them immediately as special forces. They just had like a roadblock, so I stopped the car. And I'm sitting there in uniform. I have my .38 revolver with me. And yeah, you can read the story further. But while I was waiting there, there came a Puma helicopter without the South African markings, but in South African camo. And it landed. And the next moment, you just saw the guys coming across the highway and they just started getting in. And that's how they withdrew. And I was a witness to that. I saw that. And it's in the books. And many years later, I could send a message to the officer commanding there to say, look, I'm very grateful they didn't kill me that day. Because if in later years, when I got into the shadows, I assure you, if I was in command of that team, I would have not left a young constable alive as a witness. I would have taken steps to assure the security of the team. But then I knew, I was then about 18 years old, going 19 years, and I knew that South Africa is involved in this attack. And I knew that there's been games played with our damn lives behind our backs by the politicians, the flippant turds, because they smell of what they speak and they float on what they speak. And they're playing these stupid games. And this is going to cost our lives. At some stage, we're going to cost our lives. I was totally, what's the word? Disenfranchised. That's not really the word, but suddenly my eyes opened for the evil which we had in Parliament. And I suddenly looked at this and I thought to myself, I'm not sure if these apartheid laws are right. And I actually spoke to an officer about it, wouldn't call his name, but he said to me, look, you're a policeman, you took an oath to implement the laws, whether you agree with it or not. But always remember the decision to make an arrest is always yours. And that's true. If you walk down the street or you drive down the street, here's a black guy and he's hooing there against a tree. You have a right to arrest him, of course, for urinating in public, and many of you will say, of course, you have to do it. My friend told me, where else must he go? Must he urinate? Huh? Where else? There's no garages in those days. There were no place he could go to. You're walking, you've got to go. Now you do it as behind a tree, you're trying not to show your thing to the world. It's different from a bloody student who has all the rights in the world to go to a toilet, but now he's standing there pissing against our police vehicles. Different scenario. So that's where you can pick up a guy and say, guy, let me take you to the garage. And just to show some humanity, mate. We are not there to murder and kill. Whatever, I spoke about this in the first episode at a long time. Well, I said to you, we are not there to murder and kill. We are there to protect and enforce the laws. Sadly, the laws, of course, were not always fair. In fact, they were very unfair. Now, anyway, the other thing which happened in that station is I fell into almost drowned in a church. That's another story. Yes. And also the other story there is a ghost caught me because, at some stage, if it's a small town and after midnight, you don't always have that much going on. And so a few guys, the older guys, would just park somewhere and start sleeping. I never felt comfortable with that type of thing, but, you're young and you follow suit. And one night I was sleeping on duty and the next moment I felt like a fridge or something opened here behind me, like a cold breeze of air coming from behind. And I thought to myself, not quite awake, but I thought to myself, wow, this is weird, because I'm in a fungwa, in a van. there is nothing behind me which can open without me hearing it breaking. And I was still thinking of that, and the next moment this thing just grabbed me and it started squeezing the hell out of me. You know, like when you're lying in a scrum and the entire scrum is on top of you like that. Or like when, I don't know, at school, sometimes the big guys, the 3 guys would grab you and just squeeze you until you can't breathe, you know, that type of thing. Probably gay, you know, but whatever. So it felt like that. You can't breathe, but you can think. And I knew we were danger. I knew this was dangerous because after I felt that cold breeze, I actually felt danger. I felt there's something happening. And so I grabbed down to my holster to get my firearm out because my first thought was we're being attacked by people here because, you know, in those days with the riots, even though we weren't close to Ginsberg or any of those places or Breitbach, yeah, you could actually be attacked. And many of the riot unit members were actually murdered where the vehicles got trapped into crowds and they overturned these vehicles and the guys tried to get out, shooting all the way, of course, but at some stage they overpowered and murdered. Man, it was brutal. You people have no idea, or perhaps you don't remember. It was brutal. But anyway, the ghost then got hold of me and I was struggling now to breathe and I was trying to shout for help. But my crew was also sleeping and I can't move, you know, I was about to kick him or something, but and then I thought to myself, well, you're getting to 19 years old, you're dead, you know, die a virgin. And so I started praying. And would you believe I haven't even said the word, Lord, please help me. I was still thinking of praying. The words wasn't even out. And then this thing left and it's gone. Till today, still gone. And a few days later, I walked into a police pub, which was a very nice place. And I walked in and I sat there drinking a beer. In those days, I still drank a beer here and there. And so the barman could see there's something wrong with me. It was old sergeant or something. He said, Oopus, what's wrong? Were you in a shooting? What happened? I said, no. I said, you know, we called him Oom. I said, Oom, you know, I had a strange thing which happened to me. I'm very embarrassed, but, you know, I slept on duty and this ghost caught me. And he said, really? What happened? And I said, no, this happened. He says, you know, this is strange. This is strange because then it came out that 3 other people on that in that station were also caught. They had the same symptoms in the same vehicle. And I even remember the vehicle's force number. It was SAP 6554 Mike. It was a Toyota van. Same story. They were all sleeping there in the vehicle, and the next moment, this thing grabbed them. And one guy said he struggled with it for about half an hour. He obviously wasn't as religious as me. I wasn't religious in those days at all. And so that's the story of a ghost. There's many other things which happened there. It's quite funny. You can go and read it yourself. But then the big time arrived because Lieutenant Potgieter was kind enough to let me go to a flying spot in Pretoria.